he's a really happy man.
Postman Pat and the Spring Cleaning Day. It was spring in Greendale, and everyone was busy. They were spring cleaning. Everywhere that Pat went, there was a brushing, and a beating, and a sweeping, and a polishing, and a washing, and a vacuuming going on. Carpets were hung out in the sun. Pots and pans shone like new. Chairs stood on tables. It was awful, there was nowhere to sit. And the dust made Pat sneeze. "I'll be glad when it's all done," said Pat. When he called at Thompson Ground, Mrs. Thompson was polishing the fireplace. It had brass knobs and fittings all over it, and she rubbed at them till they shone like lamps. "You want to be careful with all that rubbing," said Pat. "You'll have a genie jumping out like that one in Aladdin."
"Oh, I wish it would," said Mrs. Thompson. "It could help me with my spring cleaning."
"Do you think you could give Jess a rub while you're at it?" said Pat, laughing. Jess went and hid behind the dresser. He thought he would do his own cleaning. A good lick and a rub with his paw would be good enough for him.
"It's the first time it's been warm enough to let the fire out," said Mrs. Thompson. "I do like to give it a good polish. It looks more welcoming. Have a cup of tea, Pat. The kettle's boiled. Help yourself."
Pat went into the kitchen to brew the tea. Mrs. Thompson went outside to shake the rug. Jess came out and sniffed at the cold fireplace. It was a big old fireplace. Jess could see the chimney going up into the darkness. He seemed to like it. He put his head on one side. He listened. He listened to something, a very small sound, far, far away. His whiskers twitched. His tail went up like a car aerial. "Tea up," called Pat, coming back with the tray.
"Grand," said Mrs. Thompson, coming back with the rug. "Would Jess like some milk?"
"Come and have some milk, Jess," said Pat, looking behind the dresser. "He's not here. Jess! Where are you? Come on, Jess!"
"It was here a minute ago," said Mrs. Thompson.
"I expect he's gone to see if there are any mice in your barn," said Pat.
"Let's get this tea while it's still hot," said Mrs. Thompson.
They had a good drink and a good chat. Pat told Mrs. Thompson all the Greendale news. The Pottages have bought a new 3-piece suite, and Mrs. Goggins is having a new cooker put in this morning. Ted's mended Granny Dryden's clock, and Miss Hubbard has opened last year's rhubarb wine. And Dr. Gilbertson has a new car, a Silver Sierra. Oh yes, and Peter Fogg's crashed into a tree on his motorbike, but he's not badly hurt. And the Reverend Timms is going to Australia for a holiday, and to see his sister.
"Oh, there's always something going on in Greendale," said Mrs. Thompson. "Did you hear anything, Pat?"
"What about?"
"No, I mean just now, while you were talking. A noise."
"What sort of noise?" said Pat.
"A scratchy sort of noise. There it is again. Listen."
"It's coming from the fireplace," said Pat.
"It's up the chimney," said Mrs. Thompson.
"You haven't got mice up your chimney, have you?" said Pat.
"I hope not," said Mrs. Thompson. "I do hope not. There are so many nooks and crannies in this old house that—" "Oh, goodness me, look, Pat!"
What had made Mrs. Thompson shout and almost drop her tea? A black shape, too big for a mouse, came scrabbling down the chimney, jumped out of the fireplace and ran for the door. "What was that?" shouted Pat. Whatever it was, it had left a trail of sooty paw marks across the clean rug and across the polished floor. They chased after it, outside and across the yard. Then they saw it. It was a huge black cat, spitting and showing its claws, and sending the hens running in all directions. "Don't go near it," Pat shouted. "It looks dangerous to me." Then Towser the dog came out of his kennel like a growling rocket, and chased the strange black cat all round the yard. The black cat jumped for the wall, slipped, and fell in the water trough. Oh, what a splashing and a noise there was! There was the strange cat swimming for its life, with Towser jumping about and barking his head off. But when the black cat crawled out of the water and shook itself, it was not a black cat any more. It was a black and white cat.
"I know that cat," said Mrs. Thompson. "I've seen it somewhere. Come here, Towser, leave it alone. It won't hurt you. It's only a cat."
"It's Jess," said Pat. "Jess, what have you been doing? Come on, Puss. See, it is Jess. He was covered in soot, and the water washed it off. Poor Jess." Pat picked Jess up and gave him a cuddle. He was shivering with cold and fright, but he soon felt better.
"I do believe you and Jess went up my chimney looking for mice," said Mrs. Thompson. "Did you, Jess? Is that what you did, you naughty cat? And just look at my nice clean floor. See what a mess you've made."
Jess couldn't tell Mrs. Thompson what he had been up to, and he couldn't say he was sorry, but he did look very sorry.
"Never mind, Jess," said Mrs. Thompson. "We'll not be cross with you. But we cannot have you making sooty paw marks in all the kitchens of Greendale. Keep hold of him, Pat. I won't be a minute."
Mrs. Thompson went into the kitchen again, and came back with a plastic bowl full of soapy water.
"Just pop him in," she said, "and we'll spring clean him in no time."
"But Jess doesn't like—" Pat began, but he was too late. Jess was in the water and fighting to get out again. It was no good. Mrs. Thompson was used to all kinds of cats. She held Jess firmly until he was clean all over. Then she rinsed him under the tap to get all the soap out, popped him in a big old towel, and wrapped him up in it until he was dry. When Pat unwrapped Jess from the towel, it was a new cat that stepped out. His fur was clean and fluffy, and he smelled like a flower. But he looked cross, very cross. "Poor Jess," Pat laughed. "He doesn't like baths, but he hasn't looked so beautiful in years."
"You'll have to put him in for the Reverend's pet show in September," said Mrs. Thompson.
"I might do that," said Pat. "I might well."
"And I hope that will teach him not to go up chimneys and mess clean floors up," said Mrs. Thompson.
"Let me give you a hand," said Pat, "to clean it up."
"Oh, it's all right, really. You'd best be on your way with all those letters," said Mrs. Thompson, smiling. "I'll soon get straight. I've seen worse messes than that."
But Pat helped all the same. Soon it was time to go. Pat was on his way with a "Cheerio, Mrs. Thompson," and "Thanks for the tea." "I wonder, Jess, if you could win a prize at the pet show," said Pat as they went along the road. "I wonder. It's a good idea, that." Jess had his own thoughts about baths and pet shows, but he wasn't telling anyone what they were. One thing is sure. He never went up a chimney again.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man.
Postman Pat and the Pet Show. There was a new poster in Greendale Post Office which read, Greendale Pet Show, Vicarage Garden, May the 16th. Stalls, refreshments, lots of prizes. That'll be a good day if it's fine, said Pat. I wonder if Miss Hubbard will be selling some of her nettle wine. I mustn't miss that.
Never mind the wine, said Mrs. Goggins. Aren't you going in for the pet show? It's a lot more fun if you show something.
Well, I don't know, said Pat. I suppose we could show Julian's white mice. But the Reverend doesn't like mice. He'd run a mile if he saw them.
No, you don't want to be showing mice, said Mrs. Goggins. Why don't you show Jess? He's a lovely cat. He's sure to win a prize.
Said Pat. Not a bad idea. Perhaps I will. Mind you, I don't know what Jess will think of being in a show. When Pat told Sarah, the first thing she said was,
If that cat's going in for the pet show, he'll need a bath and a good brushing. Just look at him.
Jess had been after mice in the Pottages' barn. He looked very dusty, and he had pieces of straw in his fur.
Jess doesn't like going in the bath, said Julian. Just like somebody else in this house, said Sarah. But he'll have to go in the bath just the same, show or no show. I don't think he's had a bath since he was stuck up that tree.
After tea, Pat got the old baby bath out and put it on the kitchen table. Then he began to fill it with buckets of warm water. Sarah found a bottle of shampoo. When Jess saw what was going on, he went and hid behind the sofa. He knew the baby bath was for him. Oh dear, Jess hated having a bath. He didn't like water. He didn't like soap. He didn't like shampoo. He could wash himself with his tongue, and that, he thought, was good enough for any cat. But Sarah found Jess behind the sofa and brought him to the kitchen with all his claws out, and put him in the bath. What a splashing he made! It was like bathing 10 cats all at once. If only you'd keep still, Jess. The soap wouldn't go in your eyes, said Pat. But Jess would not keep still. Jess could not keep still. And the soap and the water and the shampoo went in his eyes, and all over the table and the floor, and over Pat and Sarah and Julian. In the end, when Pat had mopped the floor, they all had to have a bath. And then, when they were all dry again, Jess had to be brushed and combed. He didn't like this either. This was Sarah's job, and she was as gentle as she knew how to be. But Jess's fur was so tangled with going through the hedges forwards and backwards and sideways, and creeping in ditches, and hunting for mice in the hay, that the comb pulled and tugged at him, and hurt him. Poor Jess! He didn't know why he had to be so clean and tidy. When all the brushing and combing was finished, Jess looked lovely. He looked like one of the cats advertising cat food on television.
You're a real beauty now, Jess, said Sarah. You're sure to win the first prize at the show.
The next day Pat called on Miss Hubbard with a parcel, and she said,
Have you got a new cat? Where has Jess gone?
It is Jess, said Pat, laughing. He's just clean for once. And he told Miss Hubbard all about Jess's bath and the show.
I have just the thing, she said. She took a yellow silk ribbon from her sewing box. Look, isn't it pretty? She tied it in a bow round Jess's neck.
Jess hated that bow. It tickled him, and he felt so silly in a yellow silk bow. He shook it, he bit it, He scratched it. In the end it fell off. When Pat found it, it was too dusty and dirty to put on again. And then what do you think Jess did the day before the show? He went hunting rabbits somewhere the other side of the little wood. That meant going through quite a few hedges and muddy ditches. And he came back looking as though he'd never had a bath at all. "Dear me, Jess," said Pat, "you can't go to the show like that." But when Jess saw Pat getting the baby bath out again, he was off through the open door before Sarah could shut it. He didn't come back for his supper, and he found a warm place in the Pottages' barn to sleep. The next day was show day. There was no sign of Jess, so they had to go to the pet show without him.
"I don't think Jess wanted to come to the show anyway," said Julian.
At Ted Glenn's coconut shy, Pat won a big food hamper. Sarah bought a woolly jumper at Granny Dryden's knitting stall. Julian bought a chocolate cake at Mrs. Thompson's cake stall. Alf Thompson's dog, Towser, won the pet show.
"Where is Jess?"
they all asked. "I think he's decided he isn't a show cat," said Pat. They had a lovely time at the show. Jess had a lovely time too, sunbathing on the roof of Alf's pigsty. But he was waiting by the back door when Pat and Sarah and Julian came home. Jess decided to stay at home when he was sure that no one was going to get the baby bath out. When Pat opened the food hamper, he found a big tin of sardines in it. "Here's a prize for you, Jess," said Pat, "even though you didn't come to the show." And Jess ate them for his supper.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man.
Postman Pat's Safari.
Everybody knows his bright red van.
Here comes Postman Pat in his red van. He has stopped at the post office to read a new notice. Said Pat, "I mustn't miss that. I'll get my ticket today." All the people of Greendale wanted to go on the trip. Mrs. Goggins was very busy selling tickets. It seemed a long time to September the 13th. The day was marked with a red ring on every calendar in every kitchen in Greendale. Every morning Katy and Tom Pottage asked their mother,
"Is it time for the trip yet?"
and every morning Mrs. Pottage said,
"Not yet. It won't be long. Now stop pestering me and get off to school."
The day of the trip came at last. They all waited for the coach by the old pump in the village square. Miss Hubbard was wearing her new hat. It had 3 big curly feathers in it. Granny Dryden was wearing her fur coat. All the children had bags filled with crisps, sweets, and fizzy drinks. Miss Hubbard looked at her watch.
"That coach is late," she said.
Sam said, "No, it's here. Listen." Yes, now they could all hear it. It was the coach. Soon it came slowly up the hill, slowly round the bend, slowly into the square.
"Hurrah! Hurrah!"
The children cheered. They all got in with many a cry of,
"Come and sit by me!" and "Can I sit at the front?" and "Don't forget your bag!"
the door closed, whoosh, and they were off. They went over the hills and down the valley to Pencaster. They went fast on the motorway. They stopped for a drink and a visit to the toilet. Off they went again. Then they left the motorway. There were more hills and windy roads. Katy said,
We're back home.
No, this is Wales, said Pat. Look, there's a Welsh signpost. No one could read it. At last they were there. Please be back at the coach by 5 o'clock, said the Reverend Timms, and off they all went. They had a lovely time. They saw kangaroos and deer and peacocks and a tree full of monkeys. They had pony rides, and they fed the ducks. There were slides and swings for the children. Granny Dryden was the first one to find the cafe, hidden amongst the trees.
That was a lovely cup of tea, she said.
A large bird flew down and pecked at the feathers on Miss Hubbard's hat.
Help! She cried.
Shoo! Go away, shoo! Cried Pat, flapping his arms at the bird. It thinks you're another bird, Miss Hubbard. The bird would not go away, so Pat took the feathers out of the hat and put them in his pocket. They'll be safe there, he said, and we can put them back on the coach.
I think I like the hat better without feathers, said Miss Hubbard.
Then, when she had put on her hat, a monkey jumped out of the tree and pulled it off again. It ran up into the tree with the hat, then sat on a branch where no one could reach it. Poor Miss Hubbard. Pat said, We'll never catch it now. Then he had an idea. Don't move, he told Miss Hubbard, and keep your eye on the monkey. He ran to the cafe and bought a bag of nuts. He ran back to Miss Hubbard. He threw a nut to the monkey. It caught it in its mouth and ate it. Pat shook the bag of nuts at the monkey. Come on, come down for some more. Lovely nuts. The monkey crept down the branch. Pat threw some nuts on the ground. The monkey jumped down, dropped the hat, and began to nibble the nuts. Quick, Pat, said Sam. Now! Pat crept up behind the monkey and grabbed the hat.
Oh, thank you, Pat, said Miss Hubbard.
It's a bit dusty and bent, said Pat.
It'll be all right when it's been to the cleaners, said Miss Hubbard.
Later, when Granny Dryden was sitting watching the peacocks, Tom said,
Look! Look! On Mrs. Dryden's fur coat!
A little grey monkey had curled up and gone to sleep on her furry lap. It thinks you're its mum, said Pat. When 5 o'clock came, the coach driver tooted his horn to tell them it was time to go home. The children said,
Oh, can't we stay longer?
But most of them were asleep before the coach was on the motorway. The coach broke down on the steep hill into Pencaster, and who do you think had a piece of wire and a pair of pliers in his pocket to help mend the engine? Ted Glenn, of course. They all said it was the best church outing ever. Jess was asleep by the fire when they got home, but there were bits of straw and corn in his fur. I think Jess has been on safari in Alf Thompson's barn, said Pat.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat.
Postman Pat's washing day. It was a sunny Wednesday morning in Greendale. Breezy, too. Pat was on his way with the letters. It's a good day for Granny Dryden's washing day, said Pat to Jess. Jess wasn't bothered about the weather. He had a wash every day. A quick lick and a paw behind the ears kept him clean. When Pat arrived at Granny Dryden's cottage, there was no washing on the line. "That's funny," said Pat. "No washing out. She always has it out good and early. I hope she's not poorly." Pat knocked at the door and called, "Morning! Letters!" And there was Granny Dryden sitting by the fire, knitting. "No washing?" said Pat. "You've not forgotten it's Wednesday, have you? And it's a grand day for washing. Sunny and windy. It would dry in no time."
"Oh, no, Pat, I've certainly not forgotten," said Granny Dryden. "But that new machine of mine has gone and broken down, so I'm just getting on with a bit of knitting. And there's a basket full of washing waiting to be done."
"I know what we can do," said Pat. "Mrs. Pottage does her washing on a Thursday. If I put your washing basket in my van, I can ask her to pop your washing in with hers when I call with the post tomorrow. I'm sure she'd not mind. She has a big washing machine and plenty of hot water."
"Oh, Pat, that is kind,"
said Granny Dryden. Pat was on his way. When he called at Thompson Ground, there was no washing out there either. "You're missing a good drying day," said Pat to Dorothy Thompson.
"The washing'll have to wait," said Dorothy. "If I don't get this baking done, there'll be nothing for tea."
Dorothy's kitchen was full of good smells. Pat had a hot buttered scone with his cup of tea. There was no washing out at the vicarage either. The Reverend Timms was in his study, but he came out for his post. "I thought you'd have some washing on the line on a grand day like this," said Pat. "Quite right, Pat," said the Reverend. "The good Lord sent such a day for drying washing. But I have to write a sermon for Sunday, and if I don't do it today, I'll never do it." And the Reverend went back to his writing. "Dear me," said Pat, "is nobody doing their washing?" Ted Glenn was busy mending his Land Rover, so he did no washing. Miss Hubbard was busy with her bees, so she did no washing. George Lancaster was putting up a new hen house, so he did no washing. "I hope Mrs. Pottage does her washing tomorrow," said Pat. The next day was Thursday. When Pat called on Mrs. Pottage, the kitchen was full of washing smells, and the machine was swooshing and rumbling away with a full load. So he told Mrs. Pottage about Granny Dryden's washing.
"Bring it in," said Mrs. Pottage. "There's plenty of hot water." "No trouble," she said when she saw Granny Dryden's washing. "Just put it down there. Would you like a cup of tea, Pat? The kettle's just boiled."
"Thanks," said Pat. "That would be lovely." It was hot in Mrs. Pottage's kitchen. Pat took off his hat and jacket and laid them on a chair. Then he sat down for his tea. He didn't see Mrs. Pottage tipping Granny Dryden's washing out of the basket and onto a handy chair. Mrs. Pottage didn't see Pat's hat and jacket on the chair. The washing machine finished its load. Mrs. Pottage took the clean clothes out. She put Granny Dryden's washing in.
"It'll be done in no time," she said.
"I'll pop in for it when I've delivered my letters," said Pat. "She'll want to hang it out while it's still sunny." "Thanks. I'll be on my way." But when Pat went to get his hat and jacket, they weren't there. They looked all over the kitchen for them. Then Mrs. Pottage began to laugh.
"There they are," she said.
"What?" said Pat.
"In the washing machine."
Pat's hat and jacket were whizzing round and round with Granny Dryden's washing. "How did they get there?" said Pat.
"You have to watch me on wash day," said Mrs. Pottage. "You can't put anything down. It all goes in."
"They needed a wash," said Pat.
"It's a bit chilly," said Mrs. Pottage. I'll lend you something of Herbert's.
Pat went on his way, in Mr. Pottage's second-best tweed jacket and deerstalker hat. He didn't look at all like a postman. On Friday, Pat took Granny Dryden her clean washing. She was very pleased to see it.
"You look as though you've been in the wash as well," she said. "You're looking very smart."
"It wasn't all bad luck," said Pat. "Your machine breaking down." And he told her what had happened. "And I've asked Ted to pop in and see if he can mend your machine," he said.
"Oh, it's all right now," said Granny Dryden. "I'd only forgotten to plug it in. No wonder it wouldn't go. But don't tell Ted not to come. I haven't seen him for ages. We can have a good chat and he can tell me all about his sister's wedding."
And that's what happened. Ted was bringing the wedding photographs anyway, as well as the egg whisk he'd mended months ago and forgotten all about.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, all the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man.
Postman Pat, The Rainy Day. Story by John Cunliffe, from the original television series. "What a nasty day," said Pat. He was driving his post office van along Greendale, and it was raining. It had rained and rained for days and days, and it seemed that it would never stop. It rained so hard that the drops bounced off the road and made big puddles. The rain banged on the roof of the van and rattled on the windows. In the fields the sheep huddled behind the walls. Jess looked out at the rain with drooping whiskers. He hated wet days. "What a day," said Pat. "It'll be wet letters and wet everything." It was still raining when he reached the village post office.
What weather, said Mrs. Goggins. And just look at these letters.
She had a warm fire in the back room, and she had clipped the letters to string washing lines to dry.
Imagine them getting so wet, just being posted. I don't know what people do with them. And then the ink starts to smudge and you can't read the address. It's like a wet wash day, but worse.
"Aye, I see what you mean," said Pat. "But never mind, they'll soon dry."
And you'd best look out for floods up the valley, Pat. There's more rain forecast, you know. It's enough to cause a landslide.
"Don't worry," said Pat. "I'll see that the post gets through. It'll take more than a bit of rain to stop me." He gathered up the damp pile of letters and parcels. "I'll be on my way then. Cheerio!" When Pat stepped out into the street, he found that the rain had stopped, but the sky was full of black clouds. He delivered the village letters quickly, without getting wet, then set out along the country roads. Splashing through the deep puddles, squelching up muddy tracks, and splodging through farmyards deep in mud, Pat was on his way. But who was this standing at the roadside, soaking wet and covered in black mud? "Good heavens, it's Peter Fogg," said Pat. "But whatever's happened to him?" He stopped to find out.
"It's this blooming rain," said Peter. "My old tractor's bogged down in the bottom meadow. It's half flooded down there. Then I slipped in the mud up to me ears."
"You look as if you had a bath in it," said Pat.
"I just about have," said Peter. "I'm off for some dry clothes. Then I'll get the new tractor to pull out the old one."
"Good luck," said Pat. "I think it's fairing up now. Cheerio." When Pat reached the village school, some of the children were peering out to see if the rain had stopped. Charlie Pringle ran out for the letters. "Hello, Charlie," said Pat. "Where's Bill Thompson, then?"
He's off school today. They say there's flooding up at Thompson Ground. He'll be helping to get the sheep in.
"Well, don't drop the letters. They've already had one wetting," said Pat. The other children came out whilst they were talking, and now they were having a great time, jumping over puddles and in puddles and sailing paper boats. It's nice to see someone enjoying the rain, thought Pat. But time was getting on, and he must be on his way. At Greendale Farm, Pat saw Peter Fogg again, looking much better after a good wash and a change of clothes. Peter showed Pat Mr. Pottage's new tractor with its bulldozer blade fitted.
"That'll shift anything,"
he said. Pat was impressed. The next call was at the church. The Reverend Timms was having trouble with rain too.
"Good day, Pat," said the Reverend. "The rain rains on the just and the unjust."
"Good heavens," said Pat. There were buckets and bowls and basins dotted about all over the church, with water dripping into each one. The drips kept falling in different places, so that the Reverend Timms had to keep moving the buckets and basins and bowls to catch them. He was dodging about all over the church, trying to keep up with the drops.
"The church roof isn't what it was," he said. "I think we will have to have an appeal."
"I'll ask Ted Glenn to bring his ladders and have a look at that roof," said Pat. "He'll be able to fix it, I'm sure."
"Oh, thank you, Pat. That would be a great help. Just leave the letters on the pulpit. There are no drips there. Goodbye."
"Goodbye," called Pat. Just along the road, Pat met Sam Waldron with his mobile shop.
"Take it steady, Pat," said Sam. "The roads are flooded further up the valley."
"Oh, the old van'll get me through," said Pat. He stopped to chat for a few minutes and bought a bunch of bananas from Sam. Jess was glad to stay in the van to keep out of the wet. He put his head out of the window to see what Pat was doing. A large raindrop fell right on his nose and made him sneeze. Poor Jess. They were getting into the hills when they saw Mrs. Thompson standing in the road, waving them to stop. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. What's going on?" said Pat.
There are terrible floods in the top fields, Pat, and the water's brought tons of earth down and blocked the road. Come and see.
Pat walked with her down the hill and round the next bend in the road. A great pile of rocks and earth and mud lay right across the road and in the fields on both sides. Nothing could get past. "Dear me," said Pat. "Can't we telephone the village for help?"
No, the lines are down.
"Can't we walk round it?"
Oh, it's too dangerous with these floods. You could be buried if the land started to slip again.
They heard an engine coming along the road.
Here comes Alf, said Mrs. Thompson. He's going to try to get through with the tractor.
"Do you think he can do it?" said Pat.
"I'll have a jolly good try,"
Alf shouted. Off he went at top speed towards the pile of stones and earth. The engine roared and the wheels were spinning and skidding in the wet mud. The tractor climbed over the first of the rubble, and then there was a loud bang as its nose hit a large rock. It was stuck. Alf tried again and again, but it wouldn't move. It took him another 10 minutes to back out of the mess, and the tractor was damaged at the front.
"It's no good," said Alf. "We'll have to get help somehow."
Then Bill came with his model aeroplane.
I've got a good idea, he said. We can put a message on my plane and I can fly it across Greendale Farm to get help.
"That's a good idea," said Pat. "Clever lad. We'll send an airmail letter. So Pat wrote a note. Road blocked at Thompson Ground. Please send help. Pat. He tied it to the plane with a bit of Alf's binder twine. Bill stood on a little hill where he could just see the distant chimneys of Greendale Farm and twiddled his radio controls. He started the engine and the aeroplane flew up into the sky. Bill steered it carefully and it flew away towards Greendale Farm. "Away she goes!" cried Pat. "That's better than a van. I wonder if I could swap mine for a helicopter."
I think it's landed now,
said Bill.
The Thompsons went off to see to the sheep, whilst Pat sat on the wall to wait. It seemed ages since the plane had gone. He was just thinking it must have crashed when he heard a powerful engine coming up the road on the other side of the blockage. It was Peter Fogg on the new tractor with a bulldozer blade.
"Got your letter?"
he shouted. He drove into the rubble. The bulldozer blade pushed the earth and stones to one side of the road with a loud grinding and screeching of metal and stones and earth. The huge wheels bit into the ground and pushed the tractor forward. He was through. "Thanks, Peter," shouted Pat.
"Right you are,"
shouted Peter. When Sam Waldron came along in his mobile shop, there was just enough room for him to get through. Pat followed in his van. He was glad to be on his way again. Pat called at farms and houses all along the valley, delivering letters and cards and parcels. He told everyone he met about the landslide at Thompson Ground and how Peter Fogg had come to the rescue. When he saw Ted Glen by the road mending a wall, he remembered something else and stopped to talk to him. "Can you go and have a look at the church roof, Ted? The Reverend had the church full of buckets."
"I'll pop along when I've finished this wall," said Ted. "Bloomin' rain. It makes no end of work."
Miss Hubbard came past on her bike. She was on her way to choir practice. "I'd turn back if I were you," said Pat, "or you might have to swim home."
"Swim?" said Miss Hubbard. "It'll take more than a drop of rain to stop me." And on she went.
"I'll be on my way too," said Pat. "Cheerio!" As Pat wound his way along the valley, it looked like rain again. But there was a warm fireside to look forward to when all the letters had been delivered.